Hello, friend. Welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm glad you're here. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Are you settling in for the evening somewhere cold, perhaps with snow pressing against the windows? Or are you in a warmer place, where the night air drifts through with different sounds? Wherever you are, I hope you're comfortable. Tonight, we're going to explore something ancient and sprawling. Something that's lived in whispers and firelight for thousands of years. We're going to talk about Slavic folklore. Not just the stories you might have heard, the Baba Yaga in her chicken-legged hut, or the rusalki singing by moonlit rivers, but the entire world those stories came from. The beliefs, the spirits, the gods and demons, the rituals performed at crossroads and in deep forests. We're going to trace this tradition from its misty origins in the steppes and woodlands of prehistoric Europe, through the arrival of Christianity that tried to bury it, through its survival in folk practices and whispered tales, all the way to its rediscovery and the strange new life it lives today. This is a story about how people understood the world before science gave them different answers. It's about how they explained the thunder, why crops failed, what happened to the dead, and why forests felt alive with watching eyes. But more than that, it's about survival, how these beliefs adapted, transformed, went underground, merged with new religions, and refused to die even when empires and churches wanted them forgotten. The geography matters here. Picture the vast forests of Eastern Europe, oak and birch and pine stretching for hundreds of miles, broken by rivers and marshlands, by clearings where villages huddled together. This is land that transitions from the Baltic Sea in the north down through the Carpathian Mountains, spreading east toward the Ural Mountains and the endless steppes. It's cold for much of the year. Winters are long and brutal. Spring comes as a resurrection. Summer is brief and precious. Autumn brings both harvest and the creeping dread of winter's return. The Slavic peoples, a linguistic and cultural family that includes Russians, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Bulgarians, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others, emerged somewhere in these lands during the early centuries of the Common Era. Their exact origins remain debated, but by the time written records appear, they're already spread across a massive territory, speaking related languages, sharing certain customs, and worshipping similar gods. But here's what makes this story complicated and fascinating. We have almost no written records from the Slavs themselves before Christianity arrived. Unlike the Greeks or Romans, who documented their own myths extensively, or even the Norse with their later Eddas, the early Slavs left us almost nothing. What we know comes from fragments, hostile accounts by Christian missionaries who wanted to condemn what they found, occasional mentions by Byzantine or Arab travelers, linguistic traces in place names and folk songs, archaeological evidence of ritual practices, and most importantly, the folklore itself, the fairy tales, the songs, the customs that survived into the 19th and 20th centuries when scholars finally thought to write them down. So we're reconstructing a shattered mirror. We're looking at a tradition that was deliberately suppressed, that transformed under pressure, that merged with Christianity in complex ways, and that survived primarily in the memories and practices of peasants who often didn't fully understand the original meanings of what they were doing. And yet, something extraordinary happened. Despite everything, despite centuries of persecution and forgetting, the old stories survived. They changed, yes. They wore Christian masks, but underneath, something ancient persisted. Tonight, we're going to explore what that something was. We're going to meet gods who controlled thunder and fertility, spirits who lived in every house and field and forest, demons who stole children and breath, and heroes who fought impossible battles. We're going to see how these beliefs shaped daily life, how they determined when to plant crops, how to build a house, what to do with the dead, how to protect newborn babies, how to find a spouse, how to survive the dark winter months when evil things grew stronger. This matters because Slavic folklore represents one of the last great European pagan traditions to survive in living memory. While Greek and Roman paganism died out over 1,000 years ago, Slavic folk practices were still being observed in remote villages well into the 20th century. These beliefs shaped the worldview of hundreds of millions of people and continue to influence Slavic culture, literature, and identity today. Now let's begin. Let's go back to the beginning, to the time before history was written down, when the world was younger and stranger, and when the gods walked closer to earth. Before there were nations, before there were kings, before stone churches rose above the forests, there were the deep woods and the people who lived within them. The early Slavs, we're talking about the 1st century CE, maybe earlier, existed in a world we can barely reconstruct. They lived in scattered settlements, practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, raised livestock, hunted, and moved when the land became exhausted. The forest was everything: shelter, resource, danger, mystery. And the forest, they believed, was alive. Not metaphorically, actually alive. Inhabited by beings as real as your neighbor, though far more dangerous. This is the first thing we need to understand about Slavic folklore. It wasn't abstract philosophy or symbolic mythology. These were practical beliefs about a world full of spirits, forces, and personalities that affected your daily survival. The origins of these beliefs stretch back into Proto-Indo-European religion, the same deep well that fed Greek, Roman, Norse, Celtic, and Hindu mythology. Scholars can trace linguistic connections. The Slavic god Perun shares roots with the Norse Thor and the Hindu Perjunya. The word for god itself, bog in many Slavic languages, relates to words meaning to distribute or fate giver. But as the Slavic peoples developed their own identity, their beliefs took on distinctive characteristics shaped by their specific environment and way of life. At the apex sat Perun, the god of thunder, lightning, storms, and war. He was probably the most widely worshipped deity, the one whose name appears most frequently in the fragmentary records. Picture him as a warrior god, riding across the sky in a chariot, wielding either a hammer or an axe that generated lightning when it struck. Oak trees were sacred to him. They were often struck by lightning, after all, which was seen as Perun marking his territory. Warriors swore oaths by Perun. Treaties were sealed in his name. But Perun wasn't alone on the cosmic stage. There was Veles or Volos, god of earth, water, cattle, commerce, and the underworld. The relationship between Perun and Veles forms the core of what some scholars call the basic Slavic myth, an eternal cosmic conflict. Perun, the sky god, battles Veles, the earth god. Veles steals something precious, cattle, or perhaps Perun's wife or son, often taking the form of a serpent or dragon. Perun pursues him, hurling lightning bolts. Veles hides, under trees, behind stones, among cattle, in water. The chase generates storms. Eventually Perun triumphs. Veles retreats to his underworld realm, and order is restored, until the next cycle begins. This myth encoded deep truths about their world. The alternation of seasons, the relationship between sky and earth, storm and fertility, order and chaos. It explained why lightning struck certain places. It provided a framework for understanding conflict and resolution. And it sanctified both warrior and herder, storm and harvest. Beyond these two major figures, the divine landscape grows hazier. There was likely Svarig, a celestial god associated with fire and possibly the sun. His name relates to words meaning bright or clear sky. Dazbog, whose name means giving god, was associated with the sun and wealth. Strybog ruled winds. Mokosh, crucially one of the few female deities whose name we know, governed women's work, spinning, weaving, and possibly childbirth and earth's fertility. She would later merge with various Christian saints, particularly Saint Paraskevi. There were other gods whose names appear once or twice in sources and then vanish. Samargal, Rod, Belobog, Chernobog. Some of these may have been local deities, worshipped in one region but not others. Some might have been later inventions or misunderstandings. The truth is, we don't know. The early Slavs had no unified religion with standardized practices. Different tribes likely worshipped different deities or emphasized different ones. What seems clear is that there was no Slavic equivalent to Olympus, no tidy family of gods with defined relationships and personalities. The divine world was messier, more regional, more fluid, but gods were only part of the picture. Perhaps more important to daily life were the spirits. Countless spirits inhabiting every aspect of the natural and domestic world. These beings didn't rule from distant heaven. They lived in your house, your yard, your fields, the nearby forest and stream. You interacted with them constantly, and you'd better know how to do it properly. The domovoi lived in every house, usually behind the stove or under the threshold. He was the house spirit, the guardian of the family, and he needed to be respected. When a family moved to a new house, they had to invite the domovoi to come with them. There were specific rituals for this. You left him offerings: bread, milk, porridge. In return, he protected the household, warned of disasters, and kept things running smoothly. But anger him, through neglect, disrespect, or disorder in the home, and he'd make life miserable. Things would break, animals would sicken, sleep would become troubled. Outside the house, other spirits claimed their territories. The bannik lurked in the bathhouse, a dangerous place where the boundary between worlds grew thin. The domovoi presided over the yard. The ovinnik guarded the threshing barn. Each had their own personality, their own rules, their own capacity for help or harm. These weren't cute fairy tale creatures. They were forces you negotiated with, appeased, respected, and sometimes feared. They represented the recognition that you weren't alone, that the world around you was full of intentionality, that everything required proper relationship and attention. This was the foundation. A cosmos alive with consciousness, layered with beings both great and small, governed by cycles of conflict and renewal, requiring constant awareness and proper conduct. It was a worldview that made people responsible for maintaining balance, for knowing the right words, the right gestures, the right offerings at the right times. And it worked. It helped people survive in a harsh landscape. It provided explanations when children died, when crops failed, when lightning struck. It gave them tools, rituals, prohibitions, protective charms for managing an uncertain world. This was the world Christianity would try to erase. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. As Slavic society developed from scattered clans into more organized tribes and eventually early states, the religious practices developed with it. By the time we get glimpses of organized Slavic paganism in the written record, primarily through the hostile lens of Christian chroniclers in the 9th through 11th centuries, we see something more complex than simple animism. We see temples, priesthoods, organized cults, and state-sponsored worship. The best evidence comes from the Western Slavic lands, what is now Poland and the Baltic coast, where paganism survived longest and attracted the most documentation from Christian neighbors. The island of Rügen, off the Baltic coast, hosted a famous temple complex dedicated to the god Svanevit. Arab and German chroniclers described it with a mixture of fascination and horror. A massive wooden structure housing a four-headed idol, attended by priests who interpreted omens and conducted elaborate rituals. The idol held a drinking horn that was filled with wine annually. If the level had dropped when checked the next year, it portended a poor harvest. The temple accumulated wealth through offerings and conquered goods. It commanded military respect. Armies wouldn't march without consulting Svanevit's priests. Similar temple complexes existed at Arkona and other sites. These weren't primitive shrines. They were sophisticated religious centers with economic and political power. The priests formed a distinct social class with specialized knowledge and authority. They controlled sacred spaces, interpreted divine will, performed necessary rituals, and served as intermediaries between human and divine realms. In Kievan Rus, the early medieval state centered on Kiev that united various Eastern Slavic tribes. Prince Vladimir attempted to organize paganism as a state religion before his famous conversion to Christianity in 988. The primary chronicle describes how he erected statues of 6 gods on a hill near his palace. Perun with a silver head and golden mustache, Dazbog, Strybog, Samargal, Mokosh, and Korse. Sacrifices were made to them, including, according to the chronicle, human sacrifices, though we should be cautious about accepting such claims from Christian sources that had every reason to paint paganism as barbaric. The social organization of Slavic society shaped religious practice in several ways. The early Slavs practiced a form of kinship-based organization where extended family groups, clans, formed the basic social unit. The ancestors were deeply important. They weren't distant or abstract. They remained present, influential, requiring attention and offerings. Proper burial rituals were essential to ensure the dead transitioned correctly to the other world and didn't return as dangerous spirits. Many folklore practices around death, the specific number of days for mourning, the offerings left at graves, the rituals performed, trace back to these ancient concerns about maintaining proper relationship with the departed. The agricultural calendar structured religious life. This was fundamentally an agrarian society where survival depended on successful planting, growing, and harvest. The turning points of the year demanded ritual attention. Spring sowing, midsummer, harvest, and the dark winter months. Each season had its dangers and opportunities, its specific spirits who needed appeasing, its required behaviors. The spring rituals focused on fertility and renewal. There were ceremonies to wake the earth, to encourage crop growth, to ensure human and animal reproduction. Some involved sympathetic magic, jumping over fires to promote vigor, ritual plowing around villages to protect them, driving cattle between fires to purify them. Young people engaged in specific courtship rituals tied to spring celebrations. The drowning or burning of effigies representing winter or death occurred in many communities. Symbolic deaths that allowed life to return. Midsummer, the summer solstice, later Christianized as St. John's Eve, was particularly powerful and dangerous. The boundary between worlds grew thin. Herbs gathered that night had special potency. Young women floated wreaths on water for divination about marriage. People stayed up all night, jumping over fires because evil spirits were especially active. This was when rusalki water spirits, often understood as the souls of drowned or unbaptized girls, left their rivers and ponds to dance in fields and forests. They could entangle men in their hair, tickle them to death, or lure them into water. You needed protective charms and knowledge to survive midsummer night. Harvest time brought both gratitude and anxiety. The last sheaf of grain harvested was considered sacred, sometimes called the old woman or the grandfather, and treated with special rituals. Leaving offerings in the fields thanked the earth spirits. But harvest also meant approaching winter, and winter was when darkness strengthened. Winter itself required its own elaborate ritual responses. This was when the sun weakened, when cold and darkness dominated, when food stores dwindled, when people huddled in small spaces burning precious wood. The winter solstice marked the crucial turning point, the moment when the sun would begin its return. Later this became Christmas and the 12 days of Christmas, but originally it was a pagan celebration of the sun's rebirth. Rituals during this period involved divination, special foods, masking and disguising oneself, perhaps to confuse harmful spirits, and gathering together for protection and warmth. Economic activities each had their spiritual dimensions. Beekeeping required specific rituals. Bees were considered sacred, possibly messengers between worlds. Blacksmithing was magical work, transforming materials through fire, and smiths often served as ritual specialists. Hunting involved elaborate protocols. You couldn't speak certain words in the forest, you had to ask permission before killing certain animals, you needed to properly respect the spirit of the prey. The forest economy was central to Slavic life, and forest spirits were correspondingly important and dangerous. The leshy or leshy ruled the forest. He could appear as a tall man or small as grass, or as various animals. He could lead travelers in circles until they died of exhaustion or exposure. He could make people forget their way home, their names, their very selves. But he could also guide those who knew how to approach him respectfully, who left proper offerings, who showed humility. Mushroom hunters, berries gatherers, and hunters all needed to understand leshy's ways. Women's spiritual labor was particularly important and often overlooked in the fragmentary historical sources written by men. Women managed the domestic spirits, performed protective rituals for children, conducted divination, prepared healing herbs, sang the songs, and told the stories that transmitted tradition. Midwives were ritual specialists who knew the necessary charms for safe childbirth. Older women often served as keepers of traditional knowledge, teaching younger generations the proper ways. Justice and social order also had spiritual dimensions. Oaths were sacred, sworn by the gods and broken at terrible cost. Curses had real power. They weren't merely words but acts that could bring actual harm. Various objects and gestures served protective functions. Certain herbs, red thread, iron objects, specific hand signs. Knowing these was essential practical knowledge. What emerges from this is a picture of daily life saturated with spiritual awareness and ritual practice. You didn't live in a secular world occasionally punctuated by religious moments. Every action, building a house, baking bread, entering the forest, bearing a child, occurred within a framework of spiritual relationships and requirements. You were constantly navigating a world full of conscious beings with whom you needed to maintain proper relationship. This wasn't oppressive or grim. It was simply how the world worked. These practices gave people agency and tools. They weren't helpless before fate or nature. They had methods for influencing outcomes, for protecting themselves, for understanding what happened to them. The rituals created community bonds, marked time's passage, and connected people to ancestors and land. This was the developed form of Slavic paganism, organized at higher levels into state cults and temple complexes, but rooted in countless local practices and beliefs, transmitted through oral tradition, embedded in daily life, constantly performed and reperformed by communities who understood themselves as existing within a living, spirited cosmos. By the 9th and 10th centuries, we can see Slavic paganism reaching something like its mature form, or at least the form it held just before catastrophic disruption. This is when archaeological evidence becomes richer, when written accounts begin to appear, and when we can glimpse what organized Slavic religion actually looked like when it had political backing and institutional structure. The transformation from tribal religion to state cult was happening across the Slavic world. In Kiev, as mentioned, Prince Vladimir's installation of idols wasn't random personal piety. It was a political act designed to unite diverse tribes under a single religious framework that legitimized his rule. The placement of Perun's statue at the top of the pantheon reflected not just theological preference but political reality. Perun was the warrior god, the god of the Druzina, the prince's military retinue, and establishing him as supreme deity reinforced military authority. We know from various accounts that sacrifices were made at these official shrines. Animals, certainly horses, bulls, chickens. The question of human sacrifice is more contentious. Christian sources claim it happened. Whether they're reporting fact or propaganda is debated. What's clear is that sacrifice itself, the ritual offering of something valuable to establish or maintain relationship with divine forces, was central to the practice. The Latin word for priest, pontifex, means bridge builder. The Slavic priesthood served a similar function, creating and maintaining the bridge between human and divine realms through proper ritual action. The priesthood itself was developing specialized roles and knowledge. They maintained temples, conducted rituals, interpreted signs and omens, preserved oral traditions, and held authority over sacred matters. In some regions they achieved considerable political power. The priests of Svantovit on Ruggen could influence military decisions and claimed a share of war booty. They represented continuity with tradition, specialized esoteric knowledge, and access to divine will. Sacred spaces were carefully defined and maintained. Some were natural sites, particular groves, springs, stones, hills. Oak groves were especially holy, associated with Perun. These places accumulated ritual significance through repeated use over generations. Trees in sacred groves might receive offerings hung on their branches. Springs associated with healing or divination would be visited by pilgrims. Certain stones marked boundaries between worlds or served as altars. Built temples varied in complexity. Some were simple wooden structures, others elaborate multi-room complexes. The temple on Ruggen had 4 interior chambers surrounding the main sanctuary where Svantovit's statue stood. Purple curtains separated spaces. The idol itself was massive, richly decorated, clearly the work of skilled craftsmen. Weapons hung on the walls as offerings. A white horse sacred to the god was stabled nearby and used in divination rituals. These temples accumulated wealth. Successful harvests or military victories prompted thank offerings. Communities contributed regular tributes. Temple treasures included precious metals, fine textiles, weapons, and jewelry. This wealth gave religious authorities economic power independent of secular rulers, though the two were often closely intertwined. The relationship between secular and sacred authority was complex and varied by region. In some cases, tribal chiefs or princes also served religious functions, performing key rituals themselves. In others, a distinct priestly class held religious authority separate from political power. The tension between these models would later affect how easily Christianity could be imposed. Where church and state were already unified under the ruler, conversion from the top could cascade down. Where priests held independent authority, they could resist longer. Legal codes and social customs became increasingly formalized during this period, though largely unwritten. Proper behavior was enforced through social pressure, understood as maintaining cosmic order. Breaking taboos, violating oaths, showing disrespect to spirits, failing to perform necessary rituals, brought consequences not just in the afterlife but here and now. Misfortune, illness, crop failure, death. These could be interpreted as punishments for improper behavior, either one's own or the community's. The concept of fate or destiny, often personified as the Rosanitsi, female beings who determined a child's future at birth, was deeply embedded in the worldview. But this wasn't pure determinism. While initiation rituals marked important life transitions, we have fragmentary evidence of boys' initiations involving time in the forest, ordeals, and transformation into adult male status, possibly reflected later in folktales about boys sent into the forest who must complete difficult tasks. Girls' initiations around puberty involved different rituals, often connected to weaving and spinning, skills sacred to Mokosh, and preparation for sexual maturity and marriage. Marriage itself was both social contract and sacred ritual. Various customs attended it. Rituals to separate the bride from her birth family's protective spirits and incorporate her into her husband's household spirits. Ceremonies to ensure fertility, prohibitions and requirements about timing and conduct. The wedding feast wasn't merely celebration. It was ritual action that created new relationships between families and between the couple and the spirit world. Death required the most elaborate rituals of all. How the body was treated determined the dead person's afterlife existence and their relationship to the living. Cremation was common in earlier periods. Burial became more prevalent later. Objects were placed with the dead, weapons for warriors, tools for craftsmen, jewelry for women. Food and drink offerings were made. In some regions, a widow might be expected to sacrifice herself on her husband's funeral pyre, though how widespread this practice actually was remains debated. After death, the soul's journey was believed to take 40 days, a number that would later fit conveniently with Christian belief but may have been originally pagan. During this time, the soul remained close, needing guidance and support. After 40 days, it departed for the other world, the location and nature of which varied by belief. But even then, the dead remained somewhat present, especially ancestors who continued to influence family affairs and required ongoing honor. The otherworld itself was conceived various ways in different traditions, sometimes as an underground realm ruled by Veles, sometimes as a distant island or kingdom beyond the sea, sometimes as a reflection of this world but inverted, where our day was their night, our summer their winter. The dead weren't gone but transformed, existing in a parallel realm that occasionally intersected with ours at certain times and places. This consolidation of religious practice into organized cults, formal priesthoods, structured rituals, and widely shared beliefs represented paganism at its strongest. It had institutional backing, political support, economic resources, and deep roots in community life. It provided answers to life's crucial questions, tools for managing existence, and frameworks for understanding experience. It seemed permanent. It seemed like simply the way things were and always would be. But forces were gathering that would shatter this world entirely. Christianity was advancing, and the old God's time was running out. Let's pause here in the story just before everything changes, and really look at what Slavic folk belief was like when it permeated every aspect of life, when it wasn't yet folklore or paganism or superstition but simply reality, the way things were understood to work. Picture a village somewhere in what is now Ukraine or southern Poland, perhaps in the 10th century. It's early summer. The grain is growing well after careful planting rituals in spring. The forest looms close. Oak and pine and birch, dark and deep and full of presence. A river runs nearby, brown and cold, sliding between muddy banks thick with willow. The houses are wood and thatch, small and dark inside, smoky from the central hearth. Each house is more than mere shelter. It's a sacred space, oriented according to specific rules, built with rituals and prohibitions. When the foundation was laid, offerings were placed beneath the corners. Bread, wool, sometimes coins if available. The threshold is particularly important. It's a boundary between safe interior and dangerous exterior, between the domestic realm protected by the domovoi and the wild world outside. You never stand on the threshold. You never shake hands across it. You never speak to someone standing on opposite sides of it. These aren't arbitrary rules. They're based on understanding that boundaries are dangerous places where things can go wrong. Inside, behind the stove, the domovoi lives. You can't see him usually, though sometimes children catch glimpses. A small hairy figure, or perhaps a presence felt more than seen. He was here before you. He'll be here after. The house is really his. Your guests who, if you behave properly, he'll protect. Each evening, a small portion of the meal is left for him. When you leave the house for any length of time, you tell him you're going. When you return, you greet him. If something is lost, you ask him to help you find it. Housefather, play and give it back. Sometimes he does. The daily rhythm is structured by countless small observances. You don't whistle inside, it might attract spirits. You don't sweep after sunset, you might sweep away prosperity. You don't look in mirrors at night, you might see something you shouldn't. You cross yourself. Even now, before Christianity, certain protective gestures exist. When you sneeze, the soul briefly leaves the body then, and evil can enter. Salt is sacred, never to be spilled. If it is, you throw a pinch over your left shoulder where the devil stands. Bread is handled with reverence. You never throw it away, never put it face down, never cut it with a knife before tearing it first with your hands. Women's work is particularly full of ritual requirements. Spinning, turning raw flax or wool into thread, is sacred work protected by Mokosh. There are days when you mustn't spin. There are ways you must hold the distaff. There are songs you sing while spinning, songs that aren't mere entertainment but working songs that help the work succeed. When the spinning is done, you thank Mokosh. When you begin weaving, you perform small rituals to ensure the cloth will be strong and fine. Baking bread involves its own ceremonies. The dough must be spoken to correctly. Certain herbs or grains must be added. The sign of the cross, or its pagan predecessor, must be marked on the loaf. When bread comes out of the oven, you don't immediately cut it. You let it rest, let the heat spirit depart. The first piece might be offered to the domovoi or set aside for ancestors. Children are taught this from infancy. They learn what can and cannot be said, done, touched. They learn the protective charms. Bread and salt carried in a pocket when traveling, red thread tied around a wrist, certain herbs hung above a door. They learn the stories, not as fiction but as teaching tools, encoding real information about the world. The tales they hear aren't simple entertainment. They're instruction manuals. The story about the boy who disrespected the leshy and got lost in the forest for 7 years? That's teaching you how to behave in the woods. The tale about the girl who forgot to leave milk for the domovoi and then her baby got sick? That's teaching you about household spirits. The story where someone spoke a word they shouldn't have and summoned something terrible? That's teaching you the power of language. Because language itself is powerful in this worldview. Words aren't merely descriptive. They're active and effective. The right words said correctly can protect, heal, curse, bind, or free. The wrong words can bring disaster. There are secret names, true names that give power over things. The leshy's real name must never be said aloud in the forest. Certain illnesses shouldn't be named directly but referred to obliquely. Praise can attract the evil eye, so you couch it in indirect language or follow it immediately with a protective formula. Magic, if we want to call it that, though they wouldn't have, is simply advanced knowledge of how the world works. The woman who knows healing herbs isn't a witch, not yet. that accusation comes with Christianity. She's someone with valuable knowledge passed down, often through female lines. She knows which plants gathered when and prepared how can ease pain, reduce fever, help with childbirth, calm anxiety, promote sleep. But she also knows the words that must be said while gathering them, the rituals of preparation, the charms that make them efficacious. There are specialists in the community who hold deeper knowledge. The folk, often translated as wizard or sorcerer, is a ritual specialist, someone who knows the old ways thoroughly. He might be asked to divine the cause of misfortune, to conduct important rituals, to intercede with spirits. The Baba, the wise old woman, holds similar knowledge but often focuses on women's concerns. Childbirth, healing children, love magic, protection of the household. These aren't marginal figures but respected community members whose expertise is essential. Divination is common and varied. Reading patterns in molten wax dropped into water, interpreting dreams, observing animal behavior, casting lots, reading smoke or flames. These aren't frivolous fortune-telling but serious attempts to understand hidden patterns and influences. The future isn't entirely fixed, but it has currents and tendencies that can be perceived by those who know how to look. The yearly cycle brings communities together for major festivals. Maslenitsa, the farewell to winter, involves a week of feasting on pancakes, round like the sun, sledding, snowball fights, and burning a straw effigy of winter. It's joyous and raucous, a release after winter's confinement. Kapala night, midsummer, brings bonfires that everyone jumps over, young couples running into forests to gather fern flowers, which never bloom, but the search is what matters. Divination rituals with wreaths floated on water, and a sense of magic and possibility hanging thick in the summer air. These festivals aren't optional civic events. They're necessary rituals that maintain cosmic order and community health. Everyone participates. The songs sung are specific to each festival, passed down through generations, often quite old. The dances performed aren't arbitrary but ritual movements that have meaning. The foods eaten are prescribed, symbolic, part of the ritual action. Artistic expression, song, dance, decorative arts, is seamlessly woven into daily and ritual life. The embroidery on clothing isn't merely decorative. The patterns are protective symbols, ancient designs that ward off evil. The designs painted on houses, on tools, on dishes, these too carry meaning. The songs sung while working, while celebrating, while mourning. These aren't entertainment but functional magic, ways of speaking to the world. Music itself has power. Certain melodies attract certain spirits. The gusli, a stringed instrument, can enchant listeners, summon spirits, or, in the wrong hands, cause harm. The shepherd's pipe can guide animals but also influence weather. Singing can heal or harm depending on the song and singer's intent. This is a world of constant awareness and attention. You don't move through space carelessly. The road has its spirit, and you acknowledge it when traveling. The crossroads is particularly dangerous, a place where worlds meet, where demons gather at midnight, where offerings must sometimes be left. The forest edge is a boundary requiring respect. Water, rivers, streams, ponds, is both life-giving and dangerous, inhabited by rusalki and vadianoi who can drown the careless. Animals are signs and symbols. Ravens speak prophecy. Wolves are connected to the other world. Bears are sacred, possibly shapeshifters, related to ancient magic. You don't speak certain animals' names in the forest. You use kennings, indirect references. The cat is magical, seeing what humans can't. The rooster's crow drives away night spirits. The horse knows secrets, can sense danger, can sometimes speak at crucial moments. Weather is never mere weather. It's the god's action or spirit's influence. Thunder is Perun pursuing Veles. Unexplained storms might be rusalki dancing. Destructive winds might be Strybog's anger. Rain at the right time is blessing. At the wrong time, punishment or warning. You can attempt to influence weather through ritual. There are rainmaking ceremonies, prayers for sun, sacrifices to prevent storms. Illness isn't random biological malfunction. It's spiritual attack or imbalance. Someone might have cursed you, jealousy manifesting as the evil eye. You might have offended a spirit. You might have violated a taboo. Treatment involves not just herbs, but identifying the spiritual cause and addressing it. Apologies to offended spirits, counter-magic against curses, rituals to restore balance. This worldview makes people responsible but not helplessly so. Yes, powerful forces surround you, but you have tools and knowledge to navigate them. You're not a passive victim of fate, but an active participant in maintaining cosmic order. Your attention, your proper conduct, your ritual actions matter. And this sense of mattering, of being embedded in a meaningful cosmos where your actions have significance, where everything connects, this is perhaps what was most valuable about the old beliefs. People weren't isolated individuals in a mechanical universe, but participants in a living world full of relationship and meaning. This was the flourishing of Slavic folk belief. When it was complete, coherent, functional, deeply embedded in life, providing answers and tools and meaning, connecting people to ancestors and land and cosmos, giving them agency and identity and understanding. It wouldn't last. But for now, in this moment we're holding suspended, it was the entire world. The bathhouse, the banya, was a dangerous and powerful place. Here people became naked and vulnerable. The heat and steam opened the body's boundaries. The threshold between health and harm grew thin. The bannik who ruled this space was unpredictable, sometimes helpful but often malicious. You didn't go to the bathhouse alone at night. You never went third in a bathing session. The third session belonged to the bannik. You left offerings. Soap, bread, fresh water. You spoke respectfully. Women couldn't use the bathhouse during menstruation. This was both taboo and practical recognition of bodily vulnerability. The bathhouse was also where childbirth occurred, away from the main house in a space set apart. The midwife who attended knew not just practical obstetrics, but the necessary charms, prayers, and protective rituals. She knew which spirits to invoke and which to guard against. She knew the words that eased pain, the herbs that helped labor, the signs that indicated danger. After birth, she properly disposed of the afterbirth, which had its own spirit and power, performed rituals to protect the newborn from evil eye and child-stealing demons, and instructed the mother on necessary practices. For 40 days after birth, mother and child were particularly vulnerable. The mother observed specific prohibitions: what she could eat, where she could go, who could see the baby. Visitors couldn't praise the child too directly, attracting evil eye, and needed to perform small protective rituals, spitting 3 times, making certain gestures. The baby wasn't named immediately, but after a period of liminality when its status as fully human was still being established. Trade and economic exchange had spiritual dimensions too. Markets were boundary spaces where strangers met, where deception lurked, where one needed protection. You might carry protective charms when going to market. You made certain gestures when money changed hands. Veles, as god of commerce among other things, presided over economic transactions, and invoking his name sealed deals. Oaths and contracts were sacred, witnessed by gods and spirits. Breaking a sworn oath wasn't merely socially shameful, it brought supernatural punishment. This gave oaths real binding power in a society without extensive written contracts or strong state enforcement. Your word, sworn properly, was as binding as physical chains because invisible forces enforced it. Justice itself operated partly through spiritual means. Ordeal by fire or water, having someone prove innocence by handling hot iron or retrieving objects from boiling water, assumed that the gods would protect the innocent. Trial by combat similarly invoked divine judgment. These practices seem barbaric to us, but made sense in a worldview where supernatural forces actively intervened in human affairs. Curses were real legal weapons. Someone who wronged you might be cursed publicly, calling on gods and spirits to punish them. This wasn't empty threat, curses were believed to work, and the psychological power alone could be devastating. The cursed person might sicken or suffer misfortune, whether from supernatural action or psychosomatic effect hardly mattered. The curse accomplished its purpose. Education was entirely oral and practical. Children learned by participating in adult activities, by watching and imitating, by listening to stories and songs that encoded essential knowledge. Older people, grandparents especially, were repositories of wisdom and knowledge. The very old had lived long enough to experience many cycles, to accumulate deep understanding. They remembered old songs, old ways, old stories. Their knowledge kept the community connected to its past. This oral culture was sophisticated and effective. People memorized enormous amounts of material, not through rote learning but through pattern, rhythm, melody, and narrative. The songs and stories weren't static texts but living traditions that changed slightly with each performance while maintaining core content. This allowed both preservation and adaptation. The community enforced social norms through multiple mechanisms: direct social pressure, ritual punishment, public shaming, and understood spiritual consequences. Behaving badly didn't just make you unpopular. It endangered your soul, violated cosmic order, and brought potential supernatural retribution on yourself and your family. This made social cohesion both practical necessity and spiritual imperative. Gossip served important functions beyond mere entertainment. It circulated information about who was trustworthy, who followed proper practices, who might be dangerous. It policed behavior through reputation management. It also transmitted warnings about spiritual dangers. Someone saw strange lights near the old burial mound. Someone heard the leshy calling names in the forest. Someone's child got sick after a suspicious woman visited. This information helped people navigate both social and supernatural landscapes. The community's relationship with outsiders was cautious and ritualized. Strangers were dangerous, unknown quantities who might be human or might be something else. They might carry disease, malice, or evil influence. But they might also bring valuable trade goods, news, or blessings. So there were specific rituals for receiving guests, offering bread and salt, providing water for washing, showing hospitality that was both generous and cautious. These rituals acknowledged the guest's humanity while also establishing boundaries and protections. Beggars and wanderers occupied an ambiguous category. They might be ancestors or spirits in disguise, testing the community's charity. Turning them away risked supernatural punishment. But they might also be dangerous humans or malevolent entities. So you gave them something: food, small coins, clothing, but you watched carefully, and you might perform protective rituals after they left. The church building that would eventually replace the sacred groves, leadership in ritual matters varied. Some communities had designated elders or ritual specialists who directed major ceremonies. In others, different people held knowledge about different practices. This person knew healing, that one knew whether magic, another knew proper burial rites. Knowledge was distributed through the community in overlapping networks, ensuring redundancy. If someone died, others still knew the essential practices. Women and men often had separate but complementary ritual spheres. Men tended to dominate public, communal rituals, the sacrifices at community shrines, the oaths and legal rituals. Women dominated domestic and life cycle rituals, household spirits, childbirth, healing, preparation of the dead. But this wasn't absolute, and the boundaries were permeable. Older women especially could achieve considerable ritual authority. The dead themselves were part of the community's ongoing social structure. Ancestors weren't gone but remained present, influential, requiring honor and offerings. On specific days, often tied to seasonal transitions, the dead were believed to return and visit the living. Tables were set with food for them. Bathhouses were heated for their use. Conversations were held with them. This maintained the relationship between living and dead, ensuring ancestors continued to protect and guide their descendants. Burial grounds were located at village edges, boundary spaces between community and wilderness. You didn't build houses too close to them. Children were warned not to play there carelessly. But they weren't places of horror. That comes later with Christianity's emphasis on death and judgment. They were where ancestors rested, and you visited them with respect and affection, bringing offerings, seeking guidance, maintaining connection. This entire system worked as an integrated whole. The beliefs explained why things happened. The rituals provided methods for influencing outcomes. The social structures enforced compliance. The calendar organized time. The stories transmitted knowledge. The community provided support, enforcement, and shared identity. It was elegant in its coherence. Everything connected to everything else, creating a web of meaning and practice that sustained life across generations. It wasn't perfect. People still suffered and died. Crops still failed. Children still got sick. But the system provided frameworks for understanding and responding to suffering, methods for attempting to influence or manage it, and ways of maintaining hope and meaning even when things went badly. And it had evolved over thousands of years, accumulating wisdom about how to survive in a specific environment with specific resources and challenges. The practices weren't arbitrary, they encoded real practical knowledge. Plant on the waxing moon because seeds germinate better then. There may be actual lunar influence on moisture availability. Store grain in clean, dry places protected from rodents and insects, which you call honoring the ovinic. Use specific herbs for specific ailments because they actually work, though you explain their efficacy through spiritual means. The spiritual explanations and practices surrounded and reinforced practical wisdom, making it memorable, compelling, and socially enforced. This is what oral, pre-literate cultures did. They embedded essential knowledge in narrative, ritual, and social practice so it would be preserved and transmitted even without writing. This was the system at its peak. Comprehensive, coherent, functional, deeply embedded in daily life, serving both practical and spiritual needs, connecting people to ancestors, land, and cosmos. It had structure and order. It had authorities and specialists. It had shared beliefs and practices. It had methods for dealing with everything life presented. It seemed unshakable. How could something so total, so embedded, so essential to survival possibly be displaced? But Christianity was coming, and it brought a very different understanding of how the world worked. There was a moment, brief in historical terms, perhaps a few generations, when Slavic paganism achieved its maximum extent and organization. This was roughly the 9th and 10th centuries, when Slavic states were consolidating, when trade connections brought wealth, when population was growing, when the old religion seemed strong enough to last forever. In Kiev, the wooden idols stood on their hill overlooking the city, catching the sun's light, receiving sacrifices and prayers. In the Baltic regions, the great temples at Arkona and Rugin functioned as religious centers drawing pilgrims and tribute from wide areas. In the forests and villages, every community maintained its sacred grove. The gods themselves seemed present and active. When thunder rolled across the sky, that was Perun pursuing Veles. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it in their bones. When crops flourished after proper rituals, that proved the rituals worked. When someone violated a taboo and suffered misfortune, that confirmed the spirit's reality and power. The worldview was self-reinforcing through interpreted experience. Sacred spaces were well-established and maintained. Certain groves had been holy for generations, centuries perhaps. The very trees seemed to accumulate sanctity through repeated ritual use. These places felt different, quieter, charged with something beyond normal atmosphere. Whether that feeling was psychological projection or actual spiritual presence, it didn't matter to those who experienced it as real. The priesthood had refined its knowledge and practices. Divination techniques had been honed through long experience. Healing practices combined practical herbal knowledge with spiritual rituals in effective combinations. Protective magic had been tested across countless situations. The specialists knew their craft thoroughly. Social cohesion was strong. Communities were small enough that everyone knew everyone, but large enough to be viable. Extended families provided support networks. Seasonal gatherings brought villages together, strengthening regional identity. The shared religious framework gave people common language, values, and understanding. This was also the period when Slavic cultural production, though unwritten, reached remarkable sophistication. The songs, tales, and ritual poetry that would later be collected by folklorists were being created and refined during these centuries. The narrative cycles, the heroic tales, the cosmological myths, these were the products of this golden age. The artwork, primarily wooden carvings and decorative arts, since monumental stone architecture came later, showed distinctive Slavic aesthetics. The interlaced patterns, the zoomorphic designs, The geometric forms all carried symbolic meaning rooted in the religious worldview. Beauty and utility merged seamlessly. The relationship with nature was at its most developed. Generations of observation had produced detailed knowledge about animal behavior, plant properties, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. This empirical knowledge was framed in spiritual terms but was nonetheless practical and accurate. Even warfare had its ritual dimensions. Before battle, sacrifices to Perun. After victory, thank offerings and dedication of spoils to the gods. The burial of warriors with their weapons and horses. The oaths that bound war bands together. Combat itself could be seen as sacred action, warriors as serving divine purposes. There was a quality of confidence during this period, a sense that this was simply the way things were and would continue to be. The ancestors had worshipped these gods. The present generation worshipped them. Future generations would worship them. It was the natural order. No one anticipated the catastrophe approaching. Why would they? The gods had always been there. The spirits had always inhabited the world. The rituals had always worked. The new Christian churches were often built directly on top of old sacred sites. This was deliberate strategy: claim the holy places, transfer their sanctity to the new god. The church at Kiev was built where Perun's idol had stood. Monasteries appeared in sacred groves. Holy springs became saints' wells. This wasn't peaceful transition but hostile takeover. The idols were thrown down with violence. Vladimir's destruction of the wooden gods in Kiev was performed publicly, deliberately humiliating the old deities. Perun's statue was tied to horses' tails, beaten with sticks, and thrown into the Dnieper River. People wept as they watched. The message was clear: your gods are powerless. They couldn't even protect themselves. Abandon them. But destroying statues didn't destroy beliefs. The gods could exist without physical representations. The spirits had never been confined to idols anyway. You couldn't throw down the leshy's image because he lived in the forest itself. You couldn't destroy the domovoi by smashing statues because he was in every home. The Christianity that thought it had won through demolishing idols had barely begun the actual struggle. The old priesthood resisted where possible. They still had knowledge, authority, and community support. They pointed out that the old rituals had worked for generations. They questioned why people should abandon proven methods for foreign innovations. They preserved knowledge and trained successors secretly. Some were killed. Others went underground. Some accommodated by accepting positions in the new Christian order while privately maintaining old practices. The people themselves were confused and frightened. The new religion made strange demands. You had to gather in buildings for worship instead of in natural sacred places. You had to listen to priests speaking foreign languages, Greek or Latin initially, performing incomprehensible rituals. You were supposed to worship only one god, but what about all the spirits? Were you supposed to just ignore them? Wouldn't that anger them? The practical question was urgent. Would the Christian God protect them as the old gods had? Would crops still grow? Would children be born healthy? Would households be safe? These weren't abstract theological questions but matters of survival. And the only way to answer them was through experience. Early on, many people hedged their bets. They accepted baptism, it was required, and refusal brought punishment. But they also continued old practices. They attended church on Sundays, then left offerings for the domovoi at home. They had their children baptized, but also performed traditional protective rituals. They celebrated Christian holidays, but maintained the timing and many practices of old festivals. This syncretism, the mixing of Christian and pagan elements, infuriated church authorities. Bishops and priests wrote angry denunciations of people who attended church but also practiced divination, made offerings to spirits, celebrated pagan festivals, or consulted wise women instead of priests. But the denunciations continued for centuries, which tells us the practices persisted despite official disapproval. The church attempted forcible suppression. Penalties were imposed for pagan practices: fines, public penance, imprisonment, occasionally execution. Inquisitions sought out those who maintained old ways. Informants reported neighbors who left offerings at old sacred sites. The machinery of state power was turned against folk religion. but enforcement was difficult. The Slavic lands were vast, with poor communications and limited state capacity. Villages were isolated. Officials couldn't monitor everyone constantly. Communities protected their own, warning when authorities approached, hiding evidence of forbidden practices. The folk religion went underground, becoming secretive, but it survived. What changed was the character of the beliefs themselves. Under pressure, they began to transform. Gods became saints through convenient identification. Perun's thunder merged with Saint Elijah's. Mokosh became identified with the Virgin Mary or various female. And yet, and this is crucial, the beliefs didn't die. They adapted, transformed, went underground, but persisted. The domovoi continued living behind the stove in peasant houses even as churches rose in village centers. The leshy still ruled the forests even as missionaries preached. The rusalki still haunted rivers even as they were re-identified as souls needing Christian prayers. What emerged was a complex hybrid. Official Christianity on the surface, pagan continuity underneath, and both intermixed in countless ways. Peasants were simultaneously Christian and pagan, seeing no contradiction because the two systems served different functions and could coexist in practice even if not in theology. This wasn't the complete destruction Christian authorities wanted, but neither was it the preservation pagans had hoped for. It was compromise, adaptation, survival at the cost of transformation. The old world was cracking apart, but pieces of it persisted, hiding in plain sight, waiting for circumstances when they might re-emerge more openly. The unraveling had begun. The centuries following the initial Christianization saw a long, slow dissolution of organized paganism and its transformation into what we now call folklore. This process wasn't uniform across the Slavic world. Some regions held out longer than others, some converted more thoroughly, and some maintained stronger continuities with the past. The Baltic Slavs resisted longest. The temple complexes on Rugin and at Arkona continued functioning into the 12th century, long after Christianity dominated elsewhere. When German Christian forces finally conquered these regions, they did so through military crusade, not peaceful conversion. The temples were burned, the priesthoods killed or scattered, the populations forcibly baptized at sword point. The destruction was thorough and deliberate. The four-headed idol of Svantovit was chopped up and burned. The temple treasures were seized. The sacred groves were logged. The last institutional strongholds of Slavic paganism were obliterated. By 1200, no major pagan temples remained in Slavic lands. But the village shrines, the household practices, the forest rituals, these couldn't be so easily destroyed because they were everywhere and nowhere, practiced privately, hidden from official view. Christianity had won the public sphere completely, but private life remained contested territory. The church developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for suppressing folk religion. Confession became a key tool. Priests questioned people about pagan practices, assigned penance, required renunciation. Penitential manuals listed forbidden behaviors, making offerings to springs, celebrating at sacred trees, consulting diviners, performing magic, observing old festivals in traditional ways. These lists are inadvertently valuable to historians because they tell us what people were actually doing. And they were doing plenty. Even 6 or 7 centuries after official Christianization, church authorities were still complaining about the same practices. This tells us persistence on a remarkable scale. The response from folk practitioners was subterfuge and disguise. If they couldn't openly celebrate Kapala Night, they'd celebrate St. John's Eve with suspiciously similar practices. If they couldn't leave offerings at a sacred spring, they'd leave them at a saint's well. If they couldn't consult a folk, they'd visit a Christian hermit who happened to know healing and divination. The forms changed, the functions continued. Language itself became a site of concealment. The old gods weren't named directly anymore, too dangerous. But they appeared in folk tales as powerful figures with transparent characteristics. Perun became the Thunder King. Veles might appear as a wise old shepherd. Mokosh merged into various female figures, wise women, fairy godmothers, helpful grandmothers. The names changed, but the patterns persisted. Folk tales from this period encoded extraordinary amounts of older belief, preserved through narrative when direct religious practice became impossible. The witch Baba Yaga in her chicken-legged hut, living at the forest's edge, serving as death guardian and initiator. She's clearly a survival of earlier shamanic or priestly figures. The tales about heroes venturing into other worlds, fighting snake dragons, winning impossible prizes. These preserve mythological structures even as they become mere stories. The Russian byliny, heroic epic songs about bogaters, warrior heroes, similarly preserve pre-Christian worldview even though they're nominally set in Christian times. The heroes have superhuman strength, magical weapons, encounters with supernatural beings, journeys to other worlds. The underpinning mythology is pagan even when the surface details are Christianized. Regional variation became more pronounced during this period. When organized paganism existed, there was some standardization through priestly networks and shared texts, even if oral. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation brought renewed crackdowns in some areas. Both Protestant and Catholic authorities wanted purer Christianity, stripped of folk elements they considered superstitious or demonic. This triggered new waves of persecution, particularly of wise women increasingly labeled as witches. The witch trials that swept Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries affected Slavic lands too, though perhaps less severely than Western Europe. But the effect was to drive folk practices even deeper underground, to make them more secretive, to attach real danger to maintaining traditional knowledge. And yet still it survived, because it served real needs that official Christianity didn't adequately address. The church could tell you how to save your soul but might not help with your sick cow. The church offered salvation in the next life, but people needed help in this one. Folk practices provided practical tools for daily problems. Love magic, healing, protection, divination, weather control. By the 17th and 18th centuries, what remained was fragmented and transformed but still recognizable. The complete religious system of 1,000 years earlier was gone. But the worldview, the narrative structures, the folk practices, the spiritual awareness, these persisted in attenuated form. Peasants still left offerings even if they didn't remember exactly why. They still observed prohibitions even if the original reasons were forgotten. They still told stories even if the stories were now just stories rather than sacred narratives. They still celebrated festivals even if the celebrations were Christianized. Knowledge became increasingly fragmented. Earlier, specialists like the folk knew complete systems. Now, knowledge was scattered. This person knew healing herbs, that one knew love charms, another knew building rituals, yet another remembered old songs. The integrated system had shattered into pieces distributed across communities. Meanings were lost. Rituals continued, but their original significance was forgotten. Symbols persisted in decoration and design, but their reference were obscure. The coherence was gone, replaced by half-remembered fragments kept alive more by habit than understanding. The urban-rural split deepened dramatically. Cities became centers of Christianity, literacy, modernization. The countryside remained the refuge of old practices. Peasant and pagan became increasingly synonymous in elite minds. Folk culture was dismissed as ignorant superstition rather than respected as ancient wisdom. This dismissal actually aided preservation. Authorities stopped taking it seriously as a threat. If it's just ignorant superstition, why bother suppressing it aggressively? This benign neglect created space for folk culture to survive even as it was devalued. By the time we reached the 19th century, the unraveling was nearly complete. What had been a living, coherent religious system had become folklore. Quaint customs, primitive beliefs, colorful tales. It survived, yes, but transformed almost beyond recognition. Its original vitality and meaning faded. Almost, but not quite, because in the 19th century, something unexpected happened. Scholars began to pay attention, and in paying attention, they began to record, preserve, and eventually revalue what had been dismissed as mere superstition. The old beliefs had survived their persecution. Now they were about to be rediscovered. There's a particular moment in any cultural transformation when you cross from continuity to rupture, when what's changing stops being evolution and becomes extinction, when the thread connecting present to past finally snaps. For Slavic folk belief, that breaking point arrived at different times in different places, but generally somewhere in the late 18th to mid-19th centuries. This was when the last people who held complete understanding of the old systems died. Before them, knowledge might have been fragmented, practices might have been attenuated, but there were still individuals, usually elderly, usually women, usually in remote villages, who remembered the complete frameworks, who understood what the rituals meant, who could recite the entire songs, who knew the old names. After them, what remained was incomplete. Their children and grandchildren knew pieces. These early folklorists, people like Alexander Afanasiev, who collected Russian fairy tales, Václav Tilly in Czech lands, Oskar Kohlberg in Poland, the countless others, were engaged in salvage anthropology. They knew something precious was being lost and rushed to document it before it disappeared completely. Their work was revolutionary. For the first time, the oral tradition was being written down systematically. Folk tales that had circulated in countless variations were fixed in text. Songs were transcribed with their melodies. Customs were described in detail. Beliefs were recorded. But this preservation was also transformation. Oral tradition is alive, changing with each performance, adapted to circumstance and audience. Written text is fixed, dead in a sense, preserved but no longer living and growing. The folklorists saved the traditions by killing them, crystallizing them into permanent forms that could be studied but no longer naturally evolved. The effect was profound. These collected materials became the basis for all future understanding of Slavic folk belief. We know what we know because of 19th century collectors, but we know it through their eyes, filtered through their interests and biases, shaped by what they chose to record and how they recorded it. They tended to romanticize, to present folk culture as primitive purity uncorrupted by modernity. They often edited the materials, cleaning up sexual content, removing Christian elements they thought were later additions, sometimes even inventing authentic folk material that fit their expectations. The result is a somewhat artificial reconstruction that claims authenticity. Different national movements used folk culture for political purposes. Czech nationalists trying to distinguish themselves from Germans and Austrians emphasized their Slavic folk traditions. Russian Slavophiles promoted folk culture as authentic national character versus Western influence. Polish patriots under foreign occupation used folk culture to maintain identity. This political deployment of folklore created new distortions. Folk culture that had been simply life became symbolically freighted, marking national identity, resistance to oppression, authentic tradition versus foreign imposition. The materials were valued not for themselves but for what they represented politically. By the late 19th century, the breaking point was clear. Traditional village life was in terminal decline. The last native speakers of folk culture, people who lived it rather than performed it, were dying. What remained was increasingly self-conscious. People performing traditions they knew were archaic, maintaining customs they recognized as different from mainstream culture. This self-consciousness fundamentally changed the nature of the traditions. When practices are unself-conscious, simply how things are done, they have a different quality than when they become heritage, identity markers, cultural performance. The latter might look similar superficially but lacks the vital connection to lived belief. Some villages maintained practices later than others. Remote areas, especially in the far north or deep in forests, preserved older ways into the early 20th century. But these became increasingly isolated pockets, disconnected from any broader living tradition. They were holdouts, not flourishing centers. The physical environment of belief was fundamentally altered. Electric lights changed the experience of darkness. Railways and roads connected villages to cities. Photography began replacing oral memory. Clocks replaced seasonal observation. The world that had made sense of folk beliefs was vanishing. In Russia, the abolition of serfdom in 1861 disrupted peasant communities massively. Former serfs migrated, communities fragmented, traditional social structures collapsed. The changes liberated millions from bondage but also accelerated the dissolution of traditional culture that serfs had preserved precisely through their isolation from mainstream society. Literacy, reaching peasant communities, increasingly transformed consciousness. Reading and writing privileged different cognitive patterns than oral culture. Literate people think differently about memory, truth, and tradition. As peasants became literate, their relationship to oral tradition fundamentally changed. And everywhere, the old stories were becoming just stories, entertainment rather than instruction, fiction rather than truth, quaint relics rather than living knowledge. This demotion from truth to story was perhaps the most fundamental break. Once you stop believing the stories are true accounts of real forces, they become different entities entirely. By 1900, when a religion dies, it doesn't vanish completely. It leaves ruins, traces, ghosts. Slavic folk belief, by the early 20th century, was no longer a living system in any complete sense, but pieces of it remained scattered across the cultural landscape, embedded in practices people continued without fully understanding why, preserved in texts and collections, and carrying on in attenuated forms. First, there were the customs, the most visible and persistent remnants. Villages across the Slavic world continued observing traditional calendar festivals even as they reinterpreted them through Christian frameworks. Maslenitsa, the farewell to winter, remained hugely popular in Russia, the pancakes, the sledding, the bonfires, the effigies. That it was now officially pre-Lenten rather than pre-spring didn't matter to participants who experienced it as joyous community celebration connecting them to ancestors and seasons. Kapala Night, now St. John's Eve, June 23rd to 24th, continued across the Slavic world. Young people still jumped over bonfires, still floated wreaths on water for divination, still believed the night held special power. Girls still went looking for fern flowers, which don't exist. And what they found instead in the forests with their sweethearts was its own kind of magic. Christmas and New Year incorporated extraordinary amounts of pre-Christian material. The caroling groups going house to house, originally Kolyada ritualists. The divination practices, especially popular among young women seeking knowledge about future husbands. The special foods with symbolic meanings. The respect shown to ancestors by setting extra places at the table. These calendar customs were tenacious because they served multiple functions. Marking time, creating community, enabling courtship, providing entertainment, connecting people to ancestors and land. They weren't mere superstition but valuable social technology that remained useful even when their original meanings faded. Household practices persisted even more quietly. Well into the 20th century, in some remote areas almost to the present, rural Slavic households maintained relationships with house spirits. The domovoi might no longer be named or clearly conceptualized, but small offerings might still appear behind the stove, for luck. Moving to a new house still involved specific rituals to ensure prosperity. Thresholds were still treated as boundaries requiring respect. Life cycle rituals retained remarkable continuity. Birth, marriage, and death practices incorporated layers of tradition stretching back centuries. Mothers might have their babies baptized in church while also performing traditional protective rituals at home. Weddings combined Christian ceremony with elaborate folk customs. The bride's ritual lamentation, the redemption of the bride, the special foods, the symbolic actions that clearly descended from pagan practice. Funerals and mourning customs were particularly conservative, perhaps because death is universal and ancient customs around it serve deep psychological needs. The specific number of days for mourning, the offerings left at graves, the beliefs about when the soul departed and where it went, these often preserved pre-Christian concepts lightly Christianized. Folk medicine remained widespread in rural areas into the 20th century and persists in attenuated forms today. Herbalism, bone setting, midwifery, healing charms, this practical knowledge continued because it worked or seemed to, and because modern medical care was often unavailable or unaffordable in rural areas. The spiritual framework might have faded, but the techniques survived. Divination practices also persisted. Reading fortunes in cards, tea leaves, wax, dreams, these weren't confined to village-wise women but spread across social classes and urban areas, often framed as parlor games but maintaining underlying belief in hidden patterns that could be perceived. Let's get practical. How did all this actually work on the ground? How did these beliefs organize daily life, structure communities, and manage the practical necessities of survival? The calendar was the fundamental organizing principle. Not the abstract calendar we know today, but a living calendar based on observation of sun, moon, stars, and seasons, marked by rituals that were both religious and practical. The year divided not into our 12 months, but into seasons and festivals, each with its own character and requirements. Winter lasted roughly from November through February, a dark, dangerous time when the sun weakened, when evil spirits grew strong, when survival required careful management of food stores and firewood. This was when staying inside was safest. This was when the domovoi was most important because the home was your fortress against the cold and dark outside. The winter solstice, the year's darkest point, required major rituals to encourage the sun's return. People gathered, feasted, carefully, preserving stores, told stories that connected them to ancestors and tradition, and performed divination about the coming year. Kolyada, the winter solstice festival, involved caroling groups going house to house. These weren't casual singers but ritual performers whose songs and presence brought blessing for the new year. They carried symbols of fertility and light. They were welcomed with food and drink. Refusing them was dangerous, you risked misfortune. The songs they sang were ancient, filled with references to old gods and spirits, carefully preserved even when their original meanings were half forgotten. Spring began when the snow melted and birds returned. Observable facts, not abstract dates. This transition required elaborate ritual attention. The earth needed to be awakened from winter sleep. There were ceremonies involving burning or drowning effigies of winter, often called marzana or morina, beating the earth with branches to wake it, ritual plowing of first furrows, sacrifices to ensure fertility. Young people engaged in springtime courtship rituals that were both social and magical. Circle dances weren't just games but ritual movements that encouraged fertility of earth and humans alike. The songs sung referred explicitly to crop growth and human reproduction. Young women braided wreaths from flowers and herbs. These weren't mere decoration but magical objects, channels for wishes and prayers about future husbands. Planting had to be done correctly. Certain days were propitious, others dangerous. The phase of the moon mattered. You might plant on a day dedicated to Mokosh or when certain signs appeared. The seed itself was blessed before planting. Breadcrumbs or a decorated egg might be placed in the first furrow as offering. You didn't plant in complete silence but sang planting songs. Again, not for entertainment but to help growth succeed. Summer was peak work time. Tending crops, making hay, maintaining buildings, preparing for winter. But it was also when nature spirits were most active and therefore most dangerous. The rusalki left their waters during Rusalia week, around Pentecost in the Christian calendar, but originally a pagan period. During this time, you didn't venture into fields at midday, didn't swim, avoided forests. Women didn't do laundry or any needlework. Rusalki would steal the thread for their hair. The whole community observed these prohibitions because violating them endangered everyone. Kapala night, the summer solstice, the year's longest day, was magic at its peak. The boundary between worlds dissolved almost entirely. This was when impossible things became possible. Ferns bloomed, though they don't actually flower. Herbs gained maximum power. Treasures buried in earth revealed themselves. Spirits walked openly. Young couples spent the night in forests, ostensibly searching for the fern flower but actually engaging in courtship away from adult supervision. A socially sanctioned opportunity for premarital exploration that was nonetheless framed in magical terms. The bonfires lit on Kapala night weren't symbolic. They were protective and purifying. Cattle were driven through the smoke to cleanse them of disease and evil influence. People jumped over flames for health and purification. The higher you jumped, the better your harvest. Couples who jumped holding hands would marry within the year. These weren't superstitions but understood causal relationships. Fire purifies, and these ritual actions transfer that purification to people, animals, and future crops. Harvest began when the grain was ready, observed through daily inspection of the fields. The first cutting was ritual action requiring specific songs and offerings. As mentioned earlier, the last sheaf was sacred. It held the grain's spirit. Different regions handled this differently. Some left it standing in the field for birds. Others cut it carefully and kept it in the home until spring. Others wove it into a corn dolly that embodied the harvest spirit. All these practices recognized that taking grain from earth required acknowledgement and reciprocation. Threshing the grain involved its own rituals. The ovinic spirit of the threshing barn needed careful management. This was his domain, and he could be dangerous if disrespected. You couldn't thresh on certain days. You made offerings before beginning work. You were careful of fire, essential for drying grain but dangerous around dry straw, understanding that the Ovinic controlled fire in his space. Food preservation was critical for survival and surrounded by ritual practice. Pickling, smoking, drying, storing each had its proper methods and timing. The root cellar where food was stored was another boundary space, cool and dark, where spirits might lurk. You spoke politely when entering it. You left small offerings to the spirits who guarded stored food. Animal husbandry was thoroughly embedded in spiritual understanding. Your livestock weren't mere property but beings in relationship with household spirits. The domovoi, who lived in the yard and barn, could protect animals or harm them depending on his disposition. Horses were particularly sacred and mysterious. They could see spirits. They knew when danger approached. They sometimes served as mediums for otherworld communication. When you acquired a new animal, you introduced it properly to the household spirits. There were rituals for first putting cattle out to pasture in spring, for breeding season, for slaughter. Killing an animal for food required acknowledgement and thanks, not sentimentality but recognition of the exchange occurring. And there were isolated survivals, pockets where traditions continued more strongly. Remote areas of northern Russia, deep in the forests, maintained practices into the Soviet era. Some villages in the Carpathian Mountains preserved extraordinary continuities. Border regions and culturally complex areas often maintained older traditions longer. These isolated survivals became invaluable to later researchers. Ethnographers in the 20th century could still find elderly informants who remembered practices, songs, and stories that had vanished elsewhere. These final native speakers of folk culture provided crucial evidence for reconstruction. Émigré communities also preserved traditions, sometimes more purely than in home territories undergoing rapid modernization. Slavic communities in North and South America, established by immigrants in the 19th and early 20th centuries, maintained customs that were changing or disappearing in Europe. They became living museums of sorts, preserving practices from the period of immigration. What remained, then, was fragmentary but surprisingly rich, enough raw material that later scholars could reconstruct substantial understanding of the original system, enough living practice that the traditions weren't entirely academic, enough variation across regions and time periods that multiple forms survived for comparison. But what remained was also transformed. These weren't the beliefs of confident pagans who knew them as truth but the half-remembered practices of people between worlds. No longer traditional but not yet modern, carrying forward customs they didn't fully believe but couldn't quite abandon. This liminal quality, being neither living tradition nor entirely dead past but something in between, characterized the state of Slavic folk belief through much of the 20th century. It was heritage more than practice, identity more than conviction, performance more than lived reality. And yet, these fragments would prove seed material for later revivals and reconstructions. What seemed lost would be rediscovered, reinterpreted, reimagined. The old beliefs would find new life in unexpected forms. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. What happens to gods when people stop worshipping them? Where do spirits go when no one leaves offerings anymore? In the case of Slavic folk belief, they didn't disappear, they transformed, migrated into literature and art, became symbols and metaphors, influenced the cultures that grew from their ruins, and waited in text and tradition for possible revival. The afterlife of Slavic paganism in literature began almost immediately. The Russian primary chronicle, written by Christian monks in the early 12th century, preserved names of gods and descriptions of practices precisely because the authors wanted to condemn them. But in condemning, they documented. Ironically, our knowledge of what Christians destroyed comes largely from Christian sources trying to justify the destruction. Medieval and early modern literature incorporated folk elements constantly. The epic poem, The Tale of Igor's Campaign, late 12th century, is thoroughly Christian on the surface but saturated with pagan imagery and worldview. The winds are Strybog's grandsons. The sun appears as a semi-divine force. Nature itself speaks and acts with conscious intention. The poem reveals how recently converted aristocrats still thought in essentially pagan patterns. Folk tales collected in the 19th century became wildly popular beyond their original peasant audiences. Alexander Afanasyev's compilations of Russian fairy tales, 1855 to 1863, became bestsellers, rivaling the Brothers Grimm in cultural impact. These tales, featuring Baba Yaga, the Firebird, Kashii the Deathless, talking animals, magical transformations, journeys to other worlds, brought Slavic mythology to readers worldwide. But they did so as entertainment, not religion. The tales were appreciated for their narrative power, their exotic imagery, their psychological depth, but not as true accounts of how the world worked. This represented both preservation and fundamental transformation. The content survived, but the context and meaning changed entirely. Romantic nationalism in the 19th century elevated folk culture to symbolic importance. Writers, composers, and artists mined folklore for authentic national content. They weren't practicing paganism but using its imagery to construct national identity in opposition to Western European cultural domination. Russian composers incorporated folk melodies and themes. Rimsky-Korsakov's opera, The Snow Maiden, drew directly from folk tales about the seasonal spirit. Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, though loosely based on actual practices, imagined pagan sacrifice with visceral power that shocked audiences. These works popularized Slavic mythology globally while transforming it into artistic material. Visual artists also drew heavily on folklore. Viktor Vasnetsov, Ivan Bilibin, and others created iconic images of Baba Yaga, bogaters, firebirds, and Russian fairy tale scenes. These paintings and illustrations shaped how subsequent generations imagined the mythological past. But they were already interpretations, artistic visions rather than faithful recordings of tradition. Literature of the Russian Silver Age, roughly 1890 to 1920, engaged deeply with folk tradition. Poets like Alexander Blok, Andrei Bely, and Sergei Yesenin incorporated folk imagery, symbolism, and worldview into modernist and symbolist poetry. They treated folklore not as quaint artifact but as living source of poetic truth and Russian spiritual identity. Soviet policy toward folklore was complex and contradictory. Official atheism condemned religion, including folk beliefs as superstition. But folklore as cultural heritage was promoted. Folk songs, dances, crafts were all supported as authentic proletarian culture. This created the bizarre situation where the same practices could be attacked as backward superstition or celebrated as national treasure depending on framing. Soviet folklorists conducted massive collection projects, documenting practices across the USSR in unprecedented detail. This scholarly attention preserved enormous amounts of material that might otherwise have been lost. But it also froze folklore into museum pieces, studied scientifically rather than lived organically. Meanwhile, in literature and film, folklore themes remained popular. Soviet children grew up reading fairy tales, watching animated films about Baba Yaga and the Firebird, learning folk songs in school. This created widespread cultural literacy in mythological material even among urbanized, educated, atheist populations. Western interest in Slavic mythology grew in the 20th century, particularly through comparative mythology and Indo-European studies. Scholars recognized Slavic material as crucial evidence for reconstructing Proto-Indo-European religion. This academic attention gave folklore new prestige, though primarily in specialized circles. The influence extended into fantasy literature. J.R.R. Tolkien, though primarily drawing on Germanic and Celtic sources, was aware of Slavic material. Later fantasy writers incorporated Slavic elements more directly. The leshy, Baba Yaga, firebirds, and other beings entered the international fantasy vocabulary. Video games and modern media discovered Slavic mythology relatively recently but enthusiastically. Games like the Witcher series, based on Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski's novels, brought Slavic folklore to global audiences, presenting leshies, vodianois, rusalki, and other beings to millions of players worldwide who might never have encountered them otherwise. This popularization through gaming and media represents both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, it spreads awareness and generates interest. On the other, it often simplifies, misrepresents, or divorces the material from cultural context, creating popular but inaccurate understandings. The legacy appears also in less obvious places. The practice of leaving coins in house foundations when building, still observed by some people who'd be puzzled to know it derives from offerings to the domovoi. the prohibition on whistling indoors that persists in many Slavic households, the superstitions around mirrors, salt, bread. These fragments of the old worldview persist as tradition or superstition among people who would never identify as pagan. Folk medicine and herbalism experienced revival in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, often marketed as traditional knowledge or natural healing. While much of this is commercialized and romanticized, it does represent continuity with practices that stretch back through centuries. The question of authenticity haunts all these legacies. What's preserved in folk tales collected by 19th century romantics and edited for publication? How much represents actual folk belief versus collector or publisher intervention? The folk songs performed by professional ensembles, how much are they living tradition versus staged performance? Academic study provided crucial preservation but also transformation. The detailed ethnographic descriptions, the careful transcriptions, the scholarly analyses, these created permanent records but also changed the nature of what they recorded. Living tradition became academic data, performances became texts, believers became informants. And yet, for all the transformation and attenuation, something genuine persisted. The psychological archetypes in the tales still resonated. The seasonal celebrations still created community and joy. The connection to nature and ancestors still spoke to human needs. The wisdom encoded in old practices, even half understood, often proved valid. Perhaps most importantly, the material remained available for rediscovery and reinterpretation by later generations. The collections, the scholarship, the literary works, the artistic interpretations, these created a body of accessible material that people could encounter, study, and reimagine. In the late Soviet and post-Soviet periods, Slavic neopaganism began emerging, people attempting to reconstruct and practice pre-Christian religion. This represented something new, not survival of living tradition but conscious revival of dead or dying one, reconstruction based on scholarship and imagination as much as handed-down practice. These modern pagans faced the problem all revivalist movements confront. The original context is irrecoverable. You can learn the names of gods from texts, but you can't recapture what it meant to believe in them unselfconsciously. You can perform rituals based on descriptions, but you can't reproduce the worldview that made those rituals meaningful to original practitioners. Nevertheless, these movements represented renewed interest and engagement. People found value in reconnecting with pre-Christian heritage, in honoring nature spirits, in celebrating seasonal cycles. Whether this represented authentic continuation or creative invention mattered less than the needs it served for practitioners. The legacy of Slavic folk belief thus proved multiple and complex. Academic resource for understanding European paganism, artistic inspiration for centuries of creative work, fragmented practices persisting in daily life, revivalist movements attempting reconstruction, popular entertainment and fantasy media, and ongoing presence in language, custom, and consciousness of Slavic peoples. Dead as organized religion, it lived on as cultural force, artistic resource, identity marker, and source of meaning for those seeking alternatives to mainstream religious options. The gods might have fallen, but they left shadows long enough to reach the present. The 20th and 21st centuries witnessed something remarkable. The systematic scholarly reconstruction of Slavic paganism from fragmentary evidence, the academic legitimization of folklore studies, and eventually the popular rediscovery of these traditions by people seeking alternative spiritualities or cultural roots. The process began in earnest with the development of professional ethnography and folklore studies in the late 19th century. These disciplines approached folk culture not as quaint curiosity but as serious data requiring systematic collection and analysis. Scholars fanned out across rural areas, notebook in hand, recording everything: songs, tales, customs, beliefs, material culture, language, social organization. This work was often urgent, conducted with awareness that informants were dying and traditions disappearing. The ethnographers wrote detailed descriptions trying to capture not just content but context. How rituals were performed, what participants felt, how communities understood their practices. These records, for all their inevitable limitations and biases, preserved invaluable information. Archaeological discoveries added physical evidence to oral tradition. Excavations revealed temples, idol fragments, ritual objects, burial practices, and settlement patterns that confirmed, complicated, or contradicted literary and folkloric sources. The material evidence showed that folk memory preserved genuine information even when transmitted through centuries of change. Linguistic analysis provided another reconstruction tool. Comparative study of Slavic languages, combined with knowledge of other Indo-European languages, allowed scholars to work backward toward original meanings of divine names, ritual terms, and mythological concepts. Etymology revealed connections invisible to speakers of modern languages. The development of comparative mythology in the 20th century, particularly the work of Georges Dumézil on Indo-European societies, provided theoretical frameworks for understanding Slavic material. Scholars could contextualize Slavic gods and myths within broader Indo-European patterns, recognizing Perun as cousin to Thor and Zeus, seeing structural parallels between Slavic and other mythologies. This academic work gradually constructed a sophisticated understanding of what Slavic paganism had been. By the late 20th century, scholars could offer detailed reconstructions of religious worldview, social organization, ritual practice, mythological narrative, and cosmological conception, all based on painstaking analysis of fragmentary evidence. But academic reconstruction remained scholarly, addressed to specialists, written in technical language, debated in journals and conferences. The broader public knew little of this work. That began changing in the late Soviet and post-Soviet periods when restrictions on discussing religion loosened and people began searching for pre-Christian heritage. The collapse of the Soviet Union created space for religious exploration beyond state-approved orthodoxy. Some people turned to pre-Christian traditions as part of recovering suppressed national identity. Others were attracted to nature-based spirituality in reaction to Soviet industrialization and environmental destruction. Still others sought alternatives to Christianity or atheism. Slavic neopaganism emerged in various forms across different countries. In Russia, movements like Rodnovery, native faith, attempted to reconstruct pre-Christian religion based on scholarship, folklore, and inspired interpretation. In Poland, Rodzimowierstwo pursued similar goals. Ukraine, Belarus, and other Slavic nations developed their own variants. These movements faced immediate problems. The source material was fragmentary and ambiguous. Different scholars interpreted evidence differently. There was no unbroken chain of transmission, no living teachers who'd learned from their teachers stretching back to pagan times. Everything had to be reconstructed, which meant interpreted, which meant inevitably modern perspectives shaped the reconstruction. Some neopagan groups emphasized historical accuracy, studying sources meticulously and attempting faithful reconstruction. Others took freer approaches, mixing historical material with personal revelation, modern ecological concerns, or influences from other pagan traditions. The movement developed diversity reflecting its members' various priorities and understandings. Unsurprisingly, controversies erupted. Which sources were reliable? How should gaps in knowledge be filled? What role should modern concerns play in revived practice? Could you even call it revival when the break in continuity was so complete? Was this authentic tradition or modern invention wearing traditional costume? Academic scholars often criticized neo-pagan reconstructions as ahistorical, projecting modern concepts onto past societies, cherry-picking evidence to support preconceptions, or simply inventing material to fill gaps. Neo-pagans sometimes accused scholars of sterile intellectualism that missed the living spiritual essence, or of gatekeeping knowledge that belonged to all. These tensions reflected deeper questions about relationships between scholarship and practice, historical accuracy and spiritual meaning, academic authority and practitioners' experience. Similar debates occurred in revived paganisms worldwide, not just Slavic ones. Meanwhile, popular culture discovered Slavic mythology enthusiastically. Video games set in Slavic-inspired fantasy worlds introduced millions to these traditions. The success of the Witcher franchise particularly boosted global interest. Suddenly, leshy and vodianoi were recognizable names to young people across continents. This popularization brought benefits and problems. More people encountered Slavic mythology, yes, but often in simplified or distorted forms shaped by entertainment needs rather than cultural accuracy. The leshy in a video game might bear little resemblance to the forest spirit of actual folk belief, but it would shape players' understanding nonetheless. Social media and the internet facilitated community formation among interested people. Online forums, websites, and groups allowed neopagans and folklore enthusiasts to connect, share information, and develop collective understanding. This created networks that compensated somewhat for lack of local teachers and communities. Internet access also democratized knowledge, academic articles, translations of primary sources. Detailed analyses became available to anyone interested. The scholarship that had been locked in university libraries became accessible, allowing serious self-education even without formal training. Art and music communities engaged with folklore traditions, creating modern works inspired by ancient sources. Neofolk music genres drew heavily on traditional melodies and themes. Visual artists reimagined mythological figures for contemporary audiences. This creative engagement kept traditions alive in new forms. Some scholars moved beyond pure research to active collaboration with practitioners. Experimental archaeology attempted to recreate ancient practices. Living history groups performed rituals based on scholarly reconstruction. These experiments provided experiential understanding that complemented textual analysis. The development of Slavic studies programs in Western universities brought fresh perspectives. Scholars outside the cultures being studied sometimes noticed patterns invisible to insiders. International collaboration created richer, more nuanced understanding. Modern interpretation also grappled with uncomfortable aspects of historical practice. Animal sacrifice, possibly human sacrifice, patriarchal social structures, the role of violence in ritual and myth. These raised ethical questions for modern practitioners wanting to honor traditions while living by contemporary values. How much should reconstruction aim for historical fidelity versus adaptation to modern ethics? Environmental movements found resonance in folk traditions' nature reverence. The spirits inhabiting forests, rivers, and fields represented ecological wisdom that pre-industrial peoples possessed. Modern pagans and environmentalists sometimes allied, seeing traditional beliefs as resources for developing more sustainable relationships with nature. Feminist interpretations of Slavic mythology highlighted female deities and powerful women figures often marginalized in male-dominated scholarship. Mokosh, the Rusalki, Baba Yaga, and others were reinterpreted as representing feminine power, wisdom, and autonomy. Whether these interpretations matched historical understanding or projected modern concerns backward remained debated. National and political dimensions complicated everything. Some groups used pagan revival for ethnic nationalism, claiming pre-Christian traditions as marker of true national identity against foreign, Christian, influence. This sometimes veered into xenophobia or racism, tainting the broader movement by association. Other practitioners explicitly rejected nationalism, emphasizing universal human themes in the myths, welcoming non-Slavs into practice, or identifying as part of broader international paganism rather than specifically Slavic movements. These tensions reflected broader political conflicts in post-Soviet societies. By the early 21st century, Slavic folklore and mythology occupied multiple simultaneous spaces. Academic discipline with sophisticated scholarly discourse, revivalist religious movement with practicing communities, popular entertainment in media and games, artistic inspiration, nationalist symbol, environmental philosophy, and tourist attraction, festivals, museums, heritage sites. Each space had its own logic, standards, and communities. They overlapped but sometimes conflicted. Scholars might despair at popular misunderstandings, while practitioners found academic approaches spiritually arid, while entertainers prioritized dramatic effect over accuracy, while nationalists weaponized heritage for political purposes. Yet somehow this messy multiplicity kept the traditions alive and relevant. People engaged with Slavic mythology for various reasons, from various angles with various outcomes. The material proved flexible enough to serve many purposes while maintaining some connection to its roots. The rediscovery was incomplete, contested, complicated, but real. Things that had seemed lost were being found again, however imperfectly. The conversation between past and present continued. We've come a long way together tonight, from the misty origins of Slavic belief thousands of years ago, through its fluorescence in the medieval period, through its suppression and transformation under Christianity, through its survival in fragments and folklore, to its modern rediscovery and reinterpretation. It's been a journey through time, through belief, through the human need for meaning. Sit with me for a moment longer as we think about what this story means, what it gives us, what it asks of us. There's something haunting about lost religions, isn't there? The idea that entire worldviews, complete, coherent ways of understanding reality, can vanish, leaving only traces and echoes. Perun's temples are gone, his priesthood silenced, his rituals no longer performed by people who believe thunder is literally his weapon striking. The gods have fallen silent, or perhaps they've fallen asleep, waiting for the world to change in ways that might wake them again. And yet, the stories remain. Baba Yaga still flies through forests in her mortar, pestle in hand, her chicken-legged hut waiting at the border between worlds. The firebird still glows with impossible light in tales told to children. The leshy still lurks in deep woods, at least in imagination, perhaps in something more. What dies and what survives? This is the mystery at the heart of cultural transmission. What survived was what served purposes beyond original intentions. The folk tales survived not because people still believed in literal magic, but because they're good stories with psychological truth. The seasonal festivals survived because communities needed celebration, courtship opportunities, and markers of time's passage. The household practices survived because habit is powerful and small traditions comfort us even when we don't know why we maintain them. Slavic folklore's transformation from living religion to cultural heritage to modern reconstruction represents a pattern that plays out across many traditions. It's a reminder that cultures are never static. They're always changing, adapting, dying in some forms and being reborn in others. What seems lost may only be dormant. What seems dead may be transforming into something new. There's something both sad and beautiful in this. Sad because the original worldview, the one where people genuinely experienced forests as alive with spirits, where gods walked in storms, where ancestors watched from just beyond sight, that's irrecoverable. We can study it, imagine it, even attempt reconstructing it, but we can't recreate the consciousness that made it feel simply, obviously true. Beautiful because the core insights about relationship with nature, about community bonds, about seasonal rhythms, about facing death with dignity, about finding meaning in tradition, these remain accessible and valuable. We can learn from worldview we don't share, can be enriched by beliefs we don't hold, can honor traditions we didn't inherit. The modern revivals, whatever their historical accuracy or spiritual authenticity, represent something genuine. People seeking alternatives to dominant paradigms, trying to recover or reconstruct relationships with nature and tradition that modernity disrupted. Whether that's actually reviving ancient religion or creating something new inspired by it matters less than the human needs driving the attempt. We live in strange times, suspended between worlds in our own way. The old certainties have collapsed for many people, yet nothing fully satisfying has replaced them. Science explains mechanism but not meaning. Technology brings connection but often shallow. Prosperity, for some, brings comfort but not contentment. Many people feel disconnected from nature, from community, from ancestors and traditions, from any sense of belonging to narratives larger than individual lives. This is, oddly, a situation not unlike what Slavic peasants faced during Christianization, caught between dying worldview and emerging one, maintaining old practices while learning new ones, negotiating between competing systems of meaning. They survived by adaptation, by creative synthesis, by maintaining what worked while accommodating change. Perhaps their example offers wisdom for our own transitions. Perhaps the flexibility that allowed folk beliefs to survive in changed forms, the capacity to hold multiple frameworks simultaneously, the willingness to find value in traditions even when literal belief fades. Perhaps these responses to their historical challenges speak to ours. The stories themselves carry wisdom that transcends specific belief. When Baba Yaga tests heroes who seek her help, she's teaching about necessity of facing fear and proving oneself worthy of knowledge. When tales warn about disrespecting forest spirits, they're encoding ecological wisdom about treating nature with care. When rituals mark seasonal transitions, they're acknowledging rhythms larger than individual lives. These lessons remain relevant regardless of whether you believe in literal spirits. What calls to me, personally, in studying these traditions is the sense of life embedded in a meaningful cosmos. A world where everything connects, where actions have significance, where past and future meet in present moment, where beauty and meaning suffuse ordinary existence. That worldview contrasts sharply with modern narratives of isolated individuals in mechanistic universe pursuing subjective preferences. I'm not arguing we should or could return to pre-modern consciousness. Too much has changed, we can't unknow what we know. But perhaps we can selectively recover some of what was valuable. The sense of relationship with natural world, the importance of ritual and celebration, the connection across generations, the embedding of wisdom in story and tradition. The Slavic ancestors who developed these beliefs and practices were trying to solve problems we still face. How to live well together, how to raise healthy children, how to maintain hope through hardship, how to face death with dignity, how to find beauty and meaning in daily existence. Their solutions were shaped by their context, but the problems are human and universal. So what do we take forward? Not literal belief in domovoi behind the stove or leshy in the woods. Though if that speaks to you, who am I to say otherwise? But perhaps the attention those beliefs encouraged. Noticing threshold moments, respecting boundaries, maintaining proper relationship with the world around us, honoring those who came before, acting with awareness that our actions ripple outward affecting others. Perhaps we take forward the stories themselves, kept alive through retelling, offering their wisdom to new generations in new contexts. Perhaps we take forward the recognition that human beings need more than material prosperity. We need meaning, beauty, ritual, celebration, connection. Perhaps we take forward the memory that other ways of being are possible, that current arrangements aren't inevitable, that different worldviews have existed and might yet emerge. Perhaps we take forward humility about our own certainties, knowing that what seems obviously true to us might seem as strange to future generations as pagan beliefs seem to us. As I think about this long history, gods rising and falling, beliefs flowering and fading, traditions persisting through transformation, I'm struck by both fragility and resilience. Cultural traditions can be destroyed, yes, but they're remarkably hard to kill completely. Something always survives if people value it enough to protect it, to pass it forward, to adapt it for changed circumstances. You and I, listening together tonight, are part of that transmission. By paying attention to these old stories, by learning about beliefs our ancestors held, by taking time to understand worldviews different from our own, we're keeping something alive. We're maintaining the conversation between past and present. We're honoring those who came before and perhaps offering something to those who come after. The old gods may be silent. The temples may be ruins. The unbroken chain of transmission may be severed. But the stories remain, waiting to be discovered by anyone willing to listen. The wisdom encoded in ritual and tale persists, available to anyone seeking it. The beauty of these traditions, the rich imagery, the psychological depth, the connection to nature and ancestors, all of this remains accessible. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's how traditions survive their deaths and find new life. Not through unbroken continuity, but through rediscovery, reinterpretation, creative reimagining by new generations with new needs and new understanding. So let me leave you with this. Whatever your own background, whatever you believe or don't believe, whatever drew you to listen tonight, I hope you found something here worth carrying forward. Maybe it's a story that resonated, an image that captured your imagination, an idea that provoked thought, or simply appreciation for the complexity and richness of human cultural creation. We're all heirs to these traditions in some sense, not through blood necessarily, but through shared humanity. The questions Slavic peoples asked and answered are our questions too. Their struggles to find meaning, their creativity in developing solutions, their resilience through change. These are human heritage, not just Slavic. Thank you for listening, for taking this journey with me through forests and villages, through centuries and across vast territories, from living belief to folklore to modern rediscovery. I hope you'll seek out more of these stories yourself, that you'll explore the rich world of Slavic folklore further, that perhaps you'll find connections to your own traditions and questions. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you walk in a forest or pass a threshold or watch thunderstorms roll across the sky, you'll remember for a moment that people once experienced these differently, as alive, meaningful, populated by consciousness and intention. You don't have to believe it literally to appreciate the worldview, to recognize the wisdom in seeing world as alive rather than dead, as relational rather than mechanical. The old ways are gone but not forgotten. The traditions transformed but not entirely lost. The future remains unwritten, and who knows what strange forms these ancient beliefs might take in times to come. Sleep well tonight, friend, wherever you are in the world, and perhaps dream of forests full of spirits, of houses protected by unseen guardians, of seasons marked by celebration, of ancestors watching with love, of a world where meaning and magic still lived openly instead of hiding in corners and memories. Until we meet again,